Hey everyone, my name is Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.1 demo for the piece I call The Machinist. Now this is a return to A Village Corrupted, coming back and doing a new character for it. I'm trying to sort of explore this world in a way that feels as natural for me and as sort of like slow, that way I don't get burned out on it, and it gives me time to sort of build the world in the background, so the pieces that you guys don't see, the world building you don't see, is all of the stuff that I write and sort of construct around this. So by taking it slow, basically I'm making sure I don't rush into anything. Now the idea that I had for this character was, so actually what I should say, instead of talking about the idea first, what I should say is I sort of am always open to the potential of having a Village Corrupted character if I could make sure that it fits and that it makes sense. And every now and then I come up with an idea where it's just like the idea of the character really interests me so much that there's a good reason to get them in. So with this character, I had an idea of doing something that more abstractly or in a fuzzier way sort of blurs magic and technology. I haven't been very open about the world of A Village Corrupted and sort of what it all means, or I should say what the rules are and what the exact setting is, but you can tell just from sort of the art that it's got this post-apocalyptic vibe to it, it's got a fantasy vibe to it, it's got certainly a gothic vibe to it. And so I thought something that would be really interesting to explore would be a character that has almost like a magical quality to their abilities, but that it's all derived from like science and knowledge and learning, and that's where the idea for a character that affects machinery and constructs things but in a magical way came from. And that's why the books that he has, following the metaphor of like wizard and spell books and stuff, is that these are like manuals. These are like instruction manuals and like learnings. They're like scientific collections of scientific learnings as well as manuals and things. So combining that along with a more magical take on it is where this character came from. That's where the original idea for him came from. The way that I sort of like to think about him is, if you've ever played Final Fantasy Tactics, he's like the mathematician. It's like this idea that through the power of the science he can do these crazy over-the-top powerful things. That's really where I took the logic of him, I guess you could say. So now, as for his actual design, let's start talking about that since we're in the rough stages here. I'll just get this out of the way right now. Everything done with the fat pencil. Anything that you've ever seen from a past A Village Corrupted character went into this. I'm trying to keep them all very consistent, therefore the methodologies of constructing them are consistent, because I know that I'm going to deviate over time, because either my skills will change, my interests will change, my preferences will change, and in trying to keep the methodology as tight as possible, it will keep each piece from not being too far from each other, especially as these are all slowly created over the course of a long period of time. If you compare the Machinist to the Battler, the very first character, the one that the piece is just called A Village Corrupted, you can see that there has actually been quite an evolution in these pieces. But if you look at them more gradually, you can see that from one to the next, it sort of connects the dots on how it evolved. So the idea will be that when they're all collected, they all more or less feel like they're from the same thing. So if you have any questions about my methods and my, what brushes I use and all that kind of stuff, unless it's special, I won't call it out. You can go through all of the previous pieces and you can see lots of details on that. So let's get into his design, because I think that that's the more interesting thing to be referencing here. We've got goggles, we've got books, we've got some slightly high-techy things going on with him, and by slightly I just mean in this world and what you guys have seen in the previous characters. It's a little bit more high-tech, but I had certain rules that I wanted to make sure that I was creating for myself and sticking to. So if you rewind a bit, if you want to, you can see that the goggles used to have glass, and while that isn't a thing that would not exist, I think that the metal with the slits in them just feels closer to the world that I've been constructing so far. There was a lot of care taken in trying to show that this guy has a little bit of an academic vibe, but still has to participate in combat, and that he has a little bit more of a techie vibe, but without making him, of course, look like he breaks everything. And I will point out as it goes the parts where I sort of go a little too far and pull it back. The first one is the goggles. Another one that you're going to see coming up will be the Gauntlet. I start to go a little too techy with that, and then I pull it back. My natural design sense, that thing that I just put down the center of his chest, would be like a zipper, but obviously a zipper is way too much for this world. So I do the same treatment that I would sometimes do, where there's like a housing for where the zipper would be, but then it's got a stitching or a lacing instead. So the whole intent there is to try and incorporate a few things that make it look like this guy has access to some things that others wouldn't, but that it is still firmly stuck in this world, and that certain inventions just feel a little too advanced, so I can't really put that into his design, despite the fact that he's supposed to be the techier character out of the group. Another thing that I want to reference is some of the characters are sort of across different ages, and you can certainly assume from looking at like the Slayer, since he's a vampire, that he could be super old or super young. Like that could go either way. And there are other characters like the corpse mage that could easily, you know, who knows, right? Like he doesn't exactly look like he's super old, but since he's like weird and gross and gothic and all that kind of stuff, maybe he's older than he is. With this character, I wanted to very distinctly put some gray into his hair to show that he is one of the older ones. Not for any other purpose than to have a character that maybe amongst the other cast comes at everything from a different perspective. The precise perspective that he comes from, you know, I don't want him to be like that classic, like, older man that's just like, you kids haven't seen, but you know, I don't want that kind of shit. But it's more just the idea of someone who maybe is a little firmer and a little more fully realized as a character, and so maybe when conversing with the other characters, he can be a little bit of a bedrock for them, while some of the other characters are going to be a little bit more volatile. Like for instance, the Graven Templar, who is fairly young. She's a fresher recruit into that organization, so she might need a little bit more, she might be a little bit more volatile as a developing character, and so a character like this might be a good stabilizer for a character like that. Or the Hunter could be a little bit like that. The Battler certainly is like that, but he's actually immortal, so who knows exactly how old he is, and you know, he knows how old he is, and I know how old he is, but as far as the story is concerned, some people just might not know. So anyways, that was a little rambly, but the point here is that I wanted a character that didn't represent that sort of standard 25 to 35-year-old age group that's in a lot of these types of things. I wanted somebody that was at least maybe a decade older than that, and could bring a little bit of a different perspective to the group. I also think that it somewhat fits the idea of him being a little bit more learned. He's a little more academic, and since he's got this like tech-oriented thing, there could certainly be a little bit more of a tinkerer, older guy vibe about that I just thought could work pretty nicely. So that was the premise behind wanting a character like this, on top of the fact that I thought that his visual would be cool. With a lot of these characters, I think about not just what their clothing would look like, but what their choreography might look like in combat, which is why the occultist was designed the way he was, to where he's controlling blood. He's basically a blood mage, and just the visuals and what the choreography for that could be like. Same thing as the corpse mage. He's very similar in that way, where he potentially could have very, very interesting choreography in combat. And that's the way I think about this character. Lastly, in a world, because this world is mostly more on the magic fantasy side, in a world where magic is sort of more understood by the cast, it's kind of cool to have a character that's on the tech side and he is less understood. So he's a little bit of a wild card when it comes to various cast members problem solving or being in combat, and suddenly he does a thing. So that, I think, is just an interesting opportunity from a story point of view. Now, I know what some of you are probably going to be saying. You do all these characters, you talk about some of this forthcoming lore and more details, but what's the deal with that? when are we going to see something that actually looks more like an established thing? And honestly, the answer to that is I have no clue. I'm very busy, especially with the relocation to Spain, and some of the things that I do for this are a little bit deliberate attempts at building a thing, and others are just like an idea that I want to get down on paper. So as for when, I don't know, but I can assure you that I have a strong desire to take it to someplace. So it's just baby steps, and that might mean that you see like a character here or there, like for, I don't know, 10 years. I don't know how long it would take. But it's not the reason why none of this has manifested in any type of desire of commitment from people who follow me on Instagram or on YouTube or whatever, is because I don't want to get in any kind of position where I want to start a thing and I start doing like a Patreon or like any of that kind of crap, and then I can't keep up with it because I just have way too many things demanding my time right now. So right now, passion project, fun stuff, cool lineup of characters, and the hope is that it will be more sometime, but I can't commit to when. So let's talk more about the actual designs that are happening here. One of the things about trying to keep him tech-oriented but keep him in the world is the use of these like chunky iron pieces, and then occasionally mixing in something that looks like a slightly more refined metal. You could argue that his goggles and his shoulder piece there are a little bit more machined. They're a little more precise. But then like his collar and some of his other bigger, chunkier pieces are this heavy iron that you see in other characters in the past, like the Behemoth and the Occultist, and it's sort of a way of creating a little bit of an oppression in the way that characters are dressed and their costuming. It's heavy, it's unforgiving, in some ways it's impractical, sorry. It's not pleasant. However, it might be some sort of a necessity in the world. So trying to keep that heavy element of metal, that iron sort of look, especially trying to make it look less refined, I think is an important part of where the visuals have gone for this budding property. If you look at his collar and how his collar just sort of ends, it just sort of looks like it's sliced, like it's just a hard edge right there. If you rewind all the way back to the rough sketch, you'll see that I actually had like a tubing in there, like a piping, to try and trim that to make it look nice and finished, but that just doesn't fit the look. It's a nice design, but it just doesn't fit how other things have been designed in this series of characters. So once we've got sort of this design anchor point of making sure that some of these heavy metal pieces are included in there, we can start pushing it in slightly different areas. And honestly, that's how all of these characters get defined a little bit, is you find your core elements for the world and how people dress, but also the materials that they have access to, and you then find the opportunities to give them something unique that the other characters don't have. In his case, he's got some extra little detail-y type things, as well as, of course, the bigger design element, which is just these big-ass books that he's got all over his body, these manuals, reference material that he has to look at all the time in order to do what he does. Another design element that I want to point out, I used to joke when I was doing a certain cast of characters for a game once, I would put like a scar on everybody's face. Not actually everybody, but that was always like the joke. It's like, if you design a character without a scar on their face, it's like, what are they missing? Let's throw a scar on their face. Scars are, of course, an automatic, cheap way to try and tell a little bit of a story with a character. I'm going to completely speculate here for a second, but I'm sure when Cammy White was designed, they had no idea what that scar on her cheek was ever going to mean. But of course, if you throw a scar on somebody, you can always later have a side story where you investigate how that person got that scar. It's like in, I can't remember which Marvel movie, but where Nick Fury says, "The last time I trusted someone, I lost an eye." And it's like, ooh, what does that mean? So anyways, here, let's just say that the attempt here was actually to be a little bit more specific. It is true he's got a scar. It is true that it goes like across his whole head and down his face. It's true that you could say, oh, well, he just threw in a scar. which wouldn't be completely inaccurate. But the reason why I wanted to go with such a scar and have it go like across his whole face and make it look like a serious thing is I wanted to just try and tie into him learning to be the machinist and be one of these types of technical sort of magic users, and what can happen when you fuck that up. That's not at all an original idea. That's done all the time. But I just wanted to make sure that that was in his backstory to try and illustrate sort of the struggle that he had to go through to be who he is and be good at what he does. Not all of the characters have that. Of course, the corpse mage doesn't have any type of scars, so maybe to do what he does, he didn't have to risk anything. Same thing with some of the other characters. The occultist, I mean, technically he can draw his blood from himself. He's got the paddles that flip up and damage his hands, but that's sort of like, that's a different type of sacrifice. That's like a repeated smaller sacrifice that he goes through all the time to use his abilities, whereas this guy had something bigger happen at one point that was part of his journey. So anyways, that's just a big rambly explanation around how something as little as putting a cut on someone's face, a scar, or putting, you know, missing an arm or something like that, can be not only a major part of that character as far as how they act in day-to-day. A scar on his face, he might be judged by someone. Missing an arm, obviously that impacts your day-to-day. And then it also is a tool to investigate somebody's history, why something happened to them. So now you can see that while I was talking about the scar stuff, the books on his back were completed. The idea, of course, being that he has these sort of book holsters all over himself. And then those books are different because they come from either a different place or they were compiled by a different organization. And each one of these books across his body represents a different sub-learning, I guess you could say, of his class. Let's call it a class. Let's use our RPG terms. So it's like if this were his class, there's a major organization or a bunch of organizations that collect all of this material. So you could essentially make the comparison of it's like a bunch of different schools of magic, except that one of these books might be talking about hinge mechanisms, or one might be talking about more elaborate constructs, or one might just be talking about metallurgy or something like that. And these are all the things that he can then combine together in order to use his abilities. So the important part from a design perspective was to try and bring some sort of similarity, just like in the real world. Books are constructed in similar ways, but then try to bring each one of those books a little bit of character to imply that they're from somewhere different. You can see that some of that tubing that I was talking about before being on his neck guard is now in other parts, because I liked the idea of it having some of that to soften the way that it's applied to him, and that kind of sets him a little bit apart from some of the other characters that just have like these raw pieces of metal all the time. So he's got a little bit of it, but not all of it. There's also little finer details in his suit. You can see here this leather stripping with the little, not bolts, but I actually don't know what that would be called, rivets, is very similar to what the behemoth has on her. But then he's got like a little bit of smaller details, like that little bit of tubing, that little piping that separates the exterior cloth from the interior, more ribbed cloth. These are ways that I'm trying to bring a little bit of that refinement. So if you look at his arm, he's got that shoulder pad that looks like it's like finer, slightly thinner metal. You've got this piping, and then you've got this interesting, like almost super futuristic looking ribbing going on, but then by trying to bring it the right colors and juxtapose it with some of the other materials, we can bring it into this world without it being too alien. He's actually fairly symmetrical as a design in his underlaying clothing. So his shoulder guards and his general like top half, his bottom half, his belt, that's all fairly symmetrical, his neck collar thing. And then by adding some extra accessories, we can make him asymmetrical very easily. The most obvious one right off the bat is the big diagonal strap going across his body, which then leads to the two big books on one side of him. And then we can do like a big gauntlet, which was an idea from the beginning that I wanted to make sure he had, because I wanted him to be technical and intelligent and precise and scientific, but I wanted him to still be able to be in the shit. I didn't want him to be like a distant combatant that's sort of in the background, just like, you know, the hypotenuse of the, you know, that kind of crap. I didn't want him to be doing that. I wanted him to be in the middle of it. So I still wanted him to be ready for combat, which is specifically why we've got like the pyramids on his shoulder strap, to try and like communicate that he is still involved in combat. And then the other element to get the asymmetry going is this smaller book that he has on his left arm, which has been left unsnapped. It is open to try and communicate a few things. That's actually a very simple way to have some more life in here. If all of his clothes are pristine and everything looks like it's brand new and that he hasn't interacted with it, then he doesn't look as real. If you look at the books, obviously the easy thing to show wear and tear is to put dings and scratches all across the character. But then we've also got like the pages that are sort of stuck out, like he either closed it hastily or he inserted something in there and it got a little bit askew. And then you've even got something like that little book that has the leather strap that holds it in undone. And like, so what does that communicate? Does that communicate that he forgot to close it? Does that communicate that he has to access it often, so he actually leaves that one open all the time? And so that to me is just interesting ways to try and keep the character looking like they're living in the world, living in their body, living in their equipment, and that they are just more organic and real, despite being an otherwise very unreal character. Now we have a fairly interesting phase in this drawing. I knew the vibe that I wanted this gauntlet to have, but I didn't know what I wanted the design to be. And you're going to see some struggle here, which is something I always like highlighting in these pieces. I thought it'd be kind of cool to get almost like this all-seeing eye thing on his arm. And I wanted, just as a source of homage, to make it kind of look like the Eye of Vogler from Giant Robo, my favorite anime of all time. But it just really wasn't working. I couldn't get some of the shapes right, and even though I liked the idea of this whole thing being like a little arcane or a little ancient, like some sort of weird mystical element that's mixed in with all the technical stuff, I just felt like it just wasn't working. And I also was trying to prognosticate what that choreography might look like, and it just didn't seem interesting. Like this eyeball thing rotating and he's somehow interacting with it, that to me just seemed way lamer than him like busting out a book and symbols flying in the air and, you know, metal shit happening and all that kind of stuff. So even though I liked the fact, I liked some elements of this arm that you can see here, I liked all the little spiky pyramids, I just didn't like that vibe to it. And also, putting an eye, I mean, there are ways you can get around this, but putting an eyeball in the bottom left corner of this illustration away from the main character is actually kind of obnoxiously draws away from him. So I didn't want that to happen. So we enter this design, which is admittedly a little bit more basic. Some of the fact that it's more basic I think is actually its strength, because again, like I just said, it doesn't draw away from him, but it is more basic, I will admit that, as opposed to having some spherical eye mechanism, arcane thing happening, mystical thing. But I think where it ends up makes more sense. I like the idea of communicating something where this has some sort of an energy thing associated with it. It's then tying directly into his body. It sort of makes you ask, is his arm mechanical, or is this something that feeds directly into his human body and then feeds up through something? So to me, these are the interesting questions that this ends up asking, which I think are better questions than what's with the eyeball, what does that thing do, why is it like that, is there some history behind that? And I just think that that's a it's not that it's a less interesting conversation, I just don't know that it fits. Some other elements that I wanted to make sure that I added here were things like these little rivets with the sort of like arrow-like embellishment there. I just thought that was kind of interesting. I like the idea of the cloth around his sleeve being pulled up and deliberately bolted into that. I shouldn't say bolted. It's like a snap, so you can unsnap it if he has to. And I liked the fact that he had accounted for that with his outfit. That his outfit isn't just like, it's not ripped, and it's not that it just plugs nicely into the side of it. I like that there's a little bit more of a old school look to that. Here's another weird struggle I had on this, which was this tubing. You could see me sort of fucking around with it and trying to get it around and not doing a great job, and then I finally do. I was referencing some very specific tubing, and I just wasn't pulling it off very well. I think I was trying to rush it because it just didn't seem like a fun part of the drawing to be doing. Obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, sorry. Also, this piece was a little fatiguing just because there was kind of a lot going on, and I wanted to get it done. It was one of those things where I really liked the idea, and I really liked where it was going, but I wanted to kind of fast forward a little bit into it, I'll admit. So this tubing, you can see me just struggling like crazy with it, and then I finally end up getting it around, which I'm happy with the way it eventually came out, but it was obnoxious at the time. I was really annoyed. I think I was just overthinking the whole thing. I was trying to make it too specific like a thing, and then I wasn't treating it the right way, and then it was just, oi, like rewatching this right now is giving me like PTSD. But then from here, after we finish this, we finish off the rest of the gauntlet, and you're going to see the camera jump for a second because since his fist was going off screen, I was realizing that like I wasn't able to properly visualize the way his hand would be posed with seeing such a small part of it. So I just sort of take that whole arm, duplicate it to the center of the canvas, draw the hand as if it were fully on the page, and then bring that back down and then finish it off. That way I could make sure that the hand wasn't just faked. It's just like, oh, these two lines clearly define the hand, when in reality it might look wrong. So that's what I ended up doing. Real quick to reference on the tubing, I also put a little bit of a tear in the tube because what I wanted that tube to be was like the type of tube where there's like cloth over the outside of the inner tube, and so that cloth is just a little ripped right there. In a second here, you're going to see me write UGG. That's because I had accidentally merged some layers together. I merged my rough into my final line because I had an extra rough sketch here in order to try and more further define what this all looked like. So what you see here is me going through and erasing amongst my clean line, erasing away all of the rough that was in there, which is just one of those things where you see yourself do it and you're like, oh shit. And I think I had to exit the Procreate file because I drew this over Christmas break, and one of my kids was probably running around, and I exited the file and came back in, so I lost my undos, and then I was like, well, I guess I'm just doing this manually now. And so that's what this sequence right here is. So here's where the hand is starting to look weird. So I duplicate the whole arm out and I redraw the hand so I can see the whole hand here. And then I bring the whole thing back over so that I can make it just look correct, basically. Now we move into wrapping up this whole thing. So we're going to finish off the hand and then add this sort of like strap piece that connects that bigger mechanism, that sort of furnace-y looking part, onto the more core armored part of his arm. And then we'll go into his book, the book that's right there in front, and his belt. So we've got the corner protectors on the book, and we've got some of the damage there, but the big thing I wanted to do was have a sort of illustrated cover to it. Instead of it just being like a bunch of random runes and stuff, I wanted it to be as if whomever constructed this book had a title for it and had an illustration made, and it was printed that way, and it's like an illustration of like space and shit, and I just thought that that would be kind of cool. So this is really low res and it's really hard to see. At the very end, when we do the pan through, you'll probably be able to see it better, but it's sort of like fake writing at the top to imply a header, and then below that is an illustration of like space with lines and all that kind of thing. You could think of it as like Sephiroth's supernova ability as like an illustration. Math, space, etc. There in front you can see that he's got like a loincloth, like tabard like part in the front, and that was something that I really wanted to get in there, because I feel like when you notice that detail, and especially eventually when he gets like a full body shot, that will make him feel so much more medieval. It's like the most medieval element about him, having that aspect. And so if you were to a minute take off like the tubing and take off some of the random books and his goggles, you would start seeing that he actually has like quite a medieval underlying design to him, which I just thought would be really important in order to sell his placement in the world with all of his other more advanced aspects. So we've got that last book in there, and then his glove, so his one glove is rolled up, but his other glove is not rolled up. It's got this bigger sort of flange to it, and that is another thing that reinforces a little bit of that medieval vibe. So when you really look at him, he's got these aspects to him that kind of looks like there's chainmail under a tabard, although it's not, but that's sort of the visual cue that you're getting. And then you get these bigger gloves, you get the low-hanging, again, I don't know the proper term for it, but this like loincloth type front thing that a tabard would have. And so all of this is to try and bring that medieval aspect to his otherwise futuristic for his time elements. And now we'll be going into the colors. Colors for this handle just like all of the other Village Corrupted stuff. It is a light brown line, which you saw flip by super fast, set to multiply, done by selecting the line layer and then in a new layer filling it with that color. And then we're going through and we are flatting it just like all the other ones. So it's a very simple coloring process that is a little delicate for the Village Corrupted stuff. I don't do much shadow work with these pieces. The characters are mostly flat with maybe a few shadows to separate forms, and then the background is all just these stark silhouettes with like gradiented fog and things like that. So that means that it ends up bringing a lot of challenges around readability, actually, especially if you remember in my Behemoth piece I wanted her to be really dark and foreboding, but that ended up creating a lot of problems when I was trying to get the readability on a character that is just like all one color of metal basically. So with this dude, I flatted in his skin and his hair, and then I instantly just did the aged sort of gray stuff with his hair. But then in order to try and get like a universal flat for my clothing, I just went and did one color for all of his clothing and books. And now I'm going through and adding in the additional flats by using that as a selection and just basically laying in all the flats. I had a general idea of what I wanted his colors to be. I knew I wanted him to be wearing green, but I didn't know like how green, more yellow, more blue, more what. And I knew that he had a lot of leather going on and a lot of just metal. And so now trying to find the right balance, because that's the important thing here with readability, between his hair, which now that his hair is kind of gray and his metal's kind of gray, and then we've got like dark skin and a lot of leather, and trying to make sure that like all of those things are playing nicely together, and that at the end of the day you're looking at his face, like that's where he is, right? So that is what I'm trying to like balance throughout this entire thing. So now we've got a lot of the details of his skin done, and his hair is obviously done, and then some of these other values you're going to see shifting around a lot, like the metal, and you can see here I'm starting to put in some darkening for the metal, because even though I don't do shadows usually for this, that is a tool that I have for readability in order to pop him out from the metal and to really add some depth to certain aspects of him. Now this part here is a bit of a challenge. I wanted each one of these books to feel like they were from a different source, similar to you go to the bookstore, they all look different. But they had to obviously look like they were from this world. I wanted them to look like they were mostly leather bound, but you can't make it all leather if he's also wearing leather. So you'll see what I'm doing here is I'm trying to find the right desaturated versions of all of these colors to make them work together, but to not make it look like these random colors just everywhere. So every one of these books gets like a very desaturated version of itself, mostly in the warm colors, so that I can keep them looking leathery, or at the very least something that you would anticipate, a color you would anticipate a book being. And then the only real outlier is like that kind of bluish one in the bottom right, and that one's okay because I knew that it was going to be off center, so we could deal with that and darken it when the gradient comes in later. Here we've got this sort of furnace-y heat light coming out of him, which is all on a layer on the very top, so that when I start doing all of these types of crazy things with the shadows, it stays bright. And this here is just done with a color orange and then another color on top that's like a white set to like a color dodge or something like that, and then they're all blurred on top of each other and then merged together. So here's all the shadows to try and separate things, and now we're going to start building our background. I wanted our background to be a little bit in the blue range. I wanted it to shift color a little bit more than some of the other ones, so it goes a little on the purple side and then goes pretty yellow. And now the phase we're at here is where I just roughen my background really fast. This is all just with a black brush, and it's on 3 separate layers so that I can raise and lower their opacities. And so after I do this initial rough thing, I go in and I just refine that. I don't usually do a brand new one. I just start pushing and pulling on that. One of the things I want to stress too is I just try to get a couple of elements into these silhouettes. I always try to make them match a little bit what the character is, so that we can try and sell where they're from or their experiences. So I try to get a little bit of technical looking stuff. I don't want to go crazy with it. There's no like big robots or anything like that. It's more just about getting like some pulleys and some mechanisms and maybe a couple of arches that look a little bit different than some of the other ones. And that's really the point here. That's what that little curve there is for. Again, I'm not an engineer. I'm not saying that that curve is like the most futuristic thing but it feels different than everything else. Everything else in previous ones is like mostly these straight lines, and by putting these little curves in there, maybe it makes it look a little bit more advanced than what they normally have in this world. So adding a little bit of details, it's not so much that I'm adding story back there, it's more that I'm just adding little places that look like something could happen, and that makes it a little bit more interesting to look at. I put this big clock because clock, mechanical, makes sense. However, I put these really dumb hands on it at first that for some reason I thought was a good idea when I was first doing it, but I changed them later. I also wanted it to be broken like it is, just to communicate that, not all is well here. So since these layers are just lowered in opacity, you can of course see the layers behind them through them. At some point then I select the layer that is see-through and delete away the layer that is behind it, and that's how we end up clearing up the fact that they are just see-through basically. Now here we put the rim light on it. Every one of these pieces has like a key rim light, so the lighting that actually happens on the character is just some soft shadowing in order to sell separation, and a gradient to bring attention up. But then I always include like a little bit of a rim light just to put them a little bit more in their world. At the very end of everything, it'll also get a color layer to just kind of harmonize everything. It's a really low percentage though. It's like a 3% opacity color layer. So I get this color by sampling that color in the top right. However, sometimes it's still just a little bit too dull and I want the character to pop more, so I usually brighten it up a little bit just to bring more attention to the foreground. Here's a last shadow pass. I slowed this down as much as possible in the hopes that it would be clearer. You can see some darkening going like under his chin to bring his face a little bit more forward. There's going to be some other shadows, and there's some atmospherics to throw on the books to knock the books back a little bit. And then a little bit of a white highlight on his face set to like an overlay, and then with its opacity reduced quite a bit in order to bring additional attention to him. Some darkening in his nostrils just to add a little bit more contrast into what's happening on his face. And then all these Village Corrupted pieces have that like little brown scrapiness over their characters, so I threw that in there too. Here's me redoing the hands on the clock to just so that they're not so goofy and wacky. And then last but not least, I wanted a little bit more depth in the background, so I added one more layer to show some more distant ground, just to establish a little bit more of a plane back there. And so now here is the final piece. I gotta say, I really like the way this character came out. I like his background. I like the fact that it looks like he came from a more advanced, more developed place than some of the other characters. This just looks like a denser city or village or whatever it is, and I just think that that's particularly cool compared to the other characters that have these more desolate backgrounds. So I want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this one, please consider liking and subscribing. If you have more questions about some of the techniques that I use in here, I encourage you to go back through other videos, especially other A Village Corrupted characters, which you should be able to tell by the thumbnail. That should give you more answers, since this mostly focused on character design and not techniques. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.